Thank you so much for staying. You're in for a treat. This will be the best session, I promise you. And that's largely because I'm getting to talk to Anton, who is, I think he's the first celebrity translator of the 21st century. I mean, there's so many people who read books because you've translated them. It's almost like you're in the role of a curator. And earlier at the dinner on Friday night, you were saying that one of the reasons you wanted to become a translator is that you felt that Korean culture was often misunderstood or misrepresented, and that you felt in your role as a translator you could bring Korea to the world. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it's been misrepresented and also how you hope literature can change that.
Yeah, sure. I just have to remember not to cross my legs in front of royalty. I mean, my legs are so short, I don't know what there is to cross. Anyway. So with Korean literature, I think when I was coming up, there was such an idea of Korea being this poor country, which is fine. But then there was about, like, we're not a democratic country and we're struggling for democracy. And I'm like, no, that's not true. And all of these novels were about, like, democratic uprisings, like from the 80s. And I was like, no, I feel like Korea is a much more interesting country now. It's, I think there's a lot of edgy genre stuff. And a lot of really great literature, for example, written by women. But the powers that be in Korean literature were always pushing men, like middle-aged men. And I'm like, well, you've tried publishing those men over and over and over again. No one is interested in these men. And then Deborah Smith translated The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And this book won the International Booker Prize and became a huge international bestseller. And that really changed the face of Korean literature and translation. That's when people began to notice Korean literature and be like, oh, Korean literature is actually very modern, contemporary, very edgy, and it has all of these really interesting ideas. And that's the kind of literature that I wanted to promote from Korea. And there's been a lot of resistance from the Korean literary establishment, because my first book that really went against the grain was Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. Now, Bora Chung is not a mainstream author in Korea. Her book was not a bestseller. And the Literary Translation Institute of Korea was very reluctant to fund the book, but I insisted. It won a Penn Hein grant from PEN America. This is very prestigious. And then it was later shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and then it was a finalist for the National Book Award. So I knew that this would sell. And I knew that this is the kind of book that people would be interested in reading. Very funny thing, in 2021, you guys know Squid Game from Netflix. Squid Game became a global hit. And like a month after, Cursed Bunny came out. And everyone was like, oh, Cursed Bunny, you're trying to capitalize on like a new science fiction craze of Korea. And I'm like, no, I had my book under contract first. So if anything, they are capitalizing on our work. But it's really interesting how those things kind of came together in one sense. It's a very Jungian, like it was a synchronous moment in history.
And I'm so glad it came out, because if you haven't read Cursed Bunny, it's amazing. It'll blow your mind. It's strange, it's creepy, but really, really readable. One of the things you said in the workshop earlier that you led was that you see translation as both about being a good reader and a good writer. And I think that makes it very clear that translation is sort of a creative process. It's not just sort of reproducing what the writer has written. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process and your approach to translating.
Yes, so normally I would advocate for the creativity of the translation, et cetera, et cetera. But I had the Queen Mother gave a very interesting talk yesterday about reincarnation. And she asked everyone, do you believe in reincarnation? And I raised my hand. I'm not religious or spiritual, but I believe in reincarnation because I'm a literary translator. A translation is a reincarnation. It's not the same text, but at the same time it is. Do you know what I mean? So I absolutely believe in reincarnation. If it can happen to books, it can happen to people. So that's kind of how that's my approach to translation. I do think it's an absolutely creative endeavor, but I also think it's a kind of way of respecting the past and respecting the traditions and trying to create something new for the future. In the workshop today, there was some concern about how do you preserve the voice going from one language to another, and you can't. You can't. Translation is impossible. You can't preserve, it's a completely different language. There's no way to preserve the voice. But what you can do is reincarnate the voice using elements that exist in the target language tradition. For example, if, like one of the books that I translated called Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park, he has this very kind of wry, very sardonic voice in Korean, and I thought, oh, okay, I kind of get a feeling of how to translate it into English, and I asked him, what are the English writers that you like? And he said, oh, I like David Sedaris, I like Chuck Palahniuk, and I was like, oh yes, I will translate you exactly like them. And so I used those voices for that. So it's like what my friend Daisy Rockwell says, and I keep quoting Daisy Rockwell, the actual winner of the 2022 International Booker Prize. She says that, why do people keep talking about what's lost in translation? What about what's found in translation? And one of the things that you need to find in translation is the author's voice in the target language. This is not something that you carry over from one language to another, which is impossible. It's something that you have to recreate and rediscover in the target language. Thank you, Daisy.
So I think another question I have is, how do you decide which books you'll translate? Do people reach out to you? Do you have to find the books yourself? And I also noticed that you work with the same authors multiple times, so I thought once you've translated for them, do they reach out to you when they have a new book and say, would you like to translate this for me? Or how does that process work?
I come from the translation world. I don't come from literary studies. I'm not an academic. I come from, translation. I'm a translator, I'm a simultaneous interpreter. And we say in our world that your client is not your client until they hire you a second time. So when they hire you a second time, you're like, oh, yes, you're my client now. Like that's when you can claim this client as your own. And so when my authors when my authors really like my work, they're like, oh, of course I want to use Anton Hur again because A, he's used to my voice now, and B, it's just convenient for everyone. And it's a really nice thing to just, if you're an emerging translator, to find like a young or emerging author and just be friends with them and just keep working with them together and come up in the world together. I really feel like Bora Chung and I came up together. That's really created a special dynamic in the work that we do together. As to how books come to me, when I was starting out as a literary translator, no one knew I was alive. No one knew if I was a great translator or not. So I had to really just beat down a lot of doors and talk to a lot of authors in order to get permission to translate them. And then I had to do a lot of networking in order to know editors, to know who to submit to and who would be interested in a Korean literature book, because not every editor is, believe me. And now that ever since the double longlisting in 2022, I think now books are starting to come to me. And so it's like a mix of books that I seek out to translate, and I have no standards. My only standard is, if I think that this book will work in English, then I will translate it. Sometimes it's not even that. There's a book coming out in October called Blood of the Old Kings by Kim Sung-yu. This is a fantasy book. I've never translated straight up fantasy before. It's not a genre that I read a lot in. I prefer science fiction. But I really wanted to work with the publisher. It's called Tor. It's a legendary speculative fiction publisher in America that I grew up loving. And so I really wanted to work with Tor, and this is the book they gave me, and I was like, yes, I can translate this. Another thing that I learned as a professional translator is to lie all the time. A potential client would be like, do you have any background in finance? And I'm like, yes, I know everything about finance. I've translated finance. I know nothing about finance. But I will fake it enough to do the work for you, my client, and then they hire you again. So I took on this book, and I was like, I don't know how this is supposed to sound in English. These characters are not Korean. It is not set in a world that is even on our planet. So at the same time, I'm like, this means that I could just translate it however I like. So I talked to a lot of fantasy experts, and I found some voices that I can work with, and I came up with a pastiche that I think is really effective. The author really likes it, the publisher really likes it, and I'm really looking forward to it being published in October, Blood of the Old Kings. So sometimes books come to me like that. So I feel like at this point, the books kind of choose you. You don't choose the books. And it's really funny. And this has more to do with me as a reader than me as a translator, is that sometimes a book just finds you. And you know how you read a book that you supposedly randomly chose, and it speaks to you directly about like what you're going through. Like maybe you went through a really bad breakup, and then you read like a book like, I don't know, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, and then she's describing her breakup, and you're like, oh, like this is exactly what I needed to read in the moment. Like I really feel like books really do choose you and like find you somehow, and you just have to keep yourself like open to the universe and let them come to you.
I think the other book that recently came out that's very important is your debut novel, which is sold out in Bhutan. I think Junction had 20 copies, and all copies are sold. Bad news, but you guys can order it, I'm sure. So it's only been recently released, so I don't know how much time people have had to read it. It is speculative science fiction, which tracks with what you're saying. And I think one of the really beautiful things about the book is it's science fiction, and I'm not a science fiction fan, but I really enjoyed it because it's also very much about language and memory and what it means to be human. And there's quite a lot in the book that seems to be sort of your theory of translation and also your theory of art and what makes art human. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how much of your experience as a translator or your reading of other work influenced what's here now.
Oh, so much. So fundamental, so like one of the questions that I get asked a lot is because it has to do with AI, Victorian poetry, and all of these like some of them are fairly obscure fields or very specialized fields. They ask me like, wow, how much research did you do for this book? And I'm like, I didn't do any research for this book. Because I'm fundamentally a very lazy person. And I don't want to do research. Well, for this book. I am for my next book and then the book after that. And I was like, well, what do I know? Like, what do I just enjoy reading about normally that I don't have to do any research in? And so many things in this book kind of like came together that way. And so all of the ideas and many of the experiences that the characters have in this story are actually from my own life. And for the first, there are several main characters in the story, but like the first main character, like his whole story of how he met, you know, his partner and how they fell in love and how they lived an entire life together, almost exactly how it happened in my own life. Which is why this book is dedicated to my partner. And yeah, so much of what I am really did go into this book. My ideas about language, I have again, I am not a religious or mystical or a spiritual person, but I have very new age woo-woo ideas about language. For example, I will always claim that I didn't write this book, like language wrote this book, and I was just the vessel that it came through. Because sometimes I would just be writing it. I'm not even thinking about the book as I write it. I wrote it on the subway in Seoul. And because I had an hour commute to my office and then an hour commute back. And I'd just be writing it by hand in a notebook. And then I would look down and be like, oh my God, there's an entire paragraph here. I don't know where it came from. And so a lot of it was just, the language writing through me, through this book. And then people would be like, why did you write it this way? Why did you write it that way? And, I have enough of a literary education to like BS the reason behind, I wrote it because of the Lacanian real and how it, like I can make it up. But in truth, most of the time, it was just me kind of getting out of my own way and letting the language write the book. And so quite a lot of it's probably like from the most evil parts of my subconscious. Yeah, which is why it's so dark.
There are portions of it that are quite dark, and interestingly, the evil corporation is Korean. I mean, I think that's what makes it a Korean novel, right? So one of my questions is that you decided to write this novel in English. Why was that? And would you still consider yourself sort of writing in the larger Korean literature genre, or do you see yourself more as speculative fiction, or do those labels not even make sense for a book like this?
Well, like the evil corporation in this book is Korean because at first it was Chinese because this the company has to do an extremely large scale technological project. And at the time when I was writing it, at first I was like, well, no other country can really do that except China and India. And I know more Mandarin than I know, Indian languages except English. And so I was like, okay, maybe we'll do it to Chinese. And then it kind of occurred to me, like one of the beta readers was like, oh, that's kind of racist. And I was like, yeah, that is kind of racist. Like, how do I make this not racist? And then I was like, I can make it American, but I'm like, oh, like that's so done. And I was like, well, the only other country that I can pick that's not racist is to make it Korean, because I'm Korean. And then I was like, well, no one's gonna believe that Korea has like a gigantic weapons industry. And then I looked it up and, oh, we do have a gigantic weapons industry. It made me very ashamed, but very convenient for my book. So that's why the corporation, it's an arms dealer, like it's an arms corporation, like that's why it became Korean. I wrote it in English because the language that I was writing in was English, and so it insisted on, being in English. I do write in Korean. I've written a book in Korean, nonfiction, that was published last year. And I am under contract to write a novel in Korean. And it's such a weird book. Like I've sort of like approaching it the way that I approached this book, where I'm just letting my Korean write it, and it's very different. My Korean is much less funny. I don't know if this book is funny actually, but it's very depressing and depressed, and it's about painters. And like there's this woman painter who is like very inspired by Rothko, so she creates a lot of like abstract expressionist paintings, very large scale. And she has a friend who's very jealous of her, and she pushes her into the painting, and she falls into the painting, except she disappears, like literally disappears into the painting, because the painting kind of becomes a literal landscape. So it's very spec-fic in that way. I wanted to make it also very creepy, very, very uncanny, I think is for all you literary aficionados, it's very uncanny. Yeah.
I don't know if you could call this novel funny, but I think there's a lot of moments of joy, and like it's kind of dystopian. Like it's not clear at the end of the novel whether humans have survived or not. So it's not a happy novel, but there's a lot of joy in it, and a lot of the joy comes out of language, I think. My next question is, do you think you would have either of these books translated? Like, would you have this book translated into Korean, and the book you're working on, would you translate it into English? And would you do it yourself, or would you prefer someone else to do it?
So Bora Chung, the author of Cursed Bunny, is translating this book into Korean.
Wow.
So this is so funny, because like a couple of years ago, I wrote a short story in English, and it's about a translator who becomes a little too deep into his work, and he turns into his author that he's translating. And I was like, well, which author? At first I made up an author, but then I was like, you know what? What if it was Bora Chung? Because Bora Chung is very weird that way. And so I made it so that the translator, who's clearly me, turns into Bora Chung. And so I even named the author Bora Chung. And so I was like, okay, in order to, I'm not a horrible person, that horrible a person, so I have to get permission from Bora Chung to use her name and her likeness and whatever. And so I sent it to Bora, and then Bora sent it back to me, translated it in Korean. And this was her way of like giving me permission to publish it with her name. And then I sold it to Asymptote, and this is available online. You can read it in its entirety. I sold it to Asymptote, and then I told Asymptote about how Bora had given me her Korean translation of it. And they're like, oh, can we publish that too? So you can read both versions online in Asymptote magazine. So and when she heard that I was translating this book, like she was like, oh, I have to be the translator for it to exact revenge on you. Because like at the International Booker Prize ceremony, so Bora Chung, she's a really fun person. She hates attention. She hates awards. She hates being nominated for awards. Like, if you gave her an award, she will die. And I know this about her. And we're sitting at the International Booker Prize ceremony. It's a very fancy event. I look up like at this way, and they projected this entire logo like on the wall. It's an unused church that's been repurposed as an event space. And then I tell Bora, oh, Bora, I'm so sorry. And Bora's like, why? And I'm like, I feel like I ruined your life. And Bora was like, oh, it's okay. A person's life is not so easily ruined. And so she forgave me for ruining her life by translating her. But I think this is her method of like trying to get revenge against me by translating me. So yeah, we have this really fun dynamic, I gotta say, yeah.
I think we've only got time for one more question. Am I supposed to switch to Q&A? Or do we have time for one more question? We still have time? Okay, so I can still ask one more question, which is great. I think my next question is, I mean, it sounds like you have such a great relationship with Bora. Is it similar with the other authors you translate? Like, how does it work? I mean, I'm sure each relationship is as different as the person, but the fact that you've worked with several people more than once, I wondered.
Oh, there are authors I've never talked to. Yeah. Like I've done, like I think with Peksehi, I want to die, but I want to eat tteokbokki, and I still want to die. I want to die, but I still want to eat tteokbokki. Like I've talked to Peksehi like very briefly once. So in Korean culture, it's a form of deference. Like you want to give people space so that you, like, especially with authors, I feel like in Korea, because we are an American neo-colony, English has so much power in Korean society. Like Koreans, like I'm in Bhutan and everyone speaks English. And Koreans are so jealous of that because in Korea, if you speak English, it's very powerful. Like you can get any job you want, like it's ridiculous. So I don't want to impose that kind of like presence on my authors. Even if I try to be like the nicest person possible, like they may construe it that way inadvertently. So it's our way of being deferential to each other. Bora Chung is fluent in English, so I can say whatever I want to her. But even with Bora, like we don't talk about literature or work. We send cat memes to each other. Like we're clowns to each other. So we're just friends who happen to share this weird work that we do together. But for the most part, I don't really talk to my authors, and they don't really talk to me. And also, like I feel like I work with the best authors in Korean literature, like the best. And their writing is so good that I don't need to ask them a question. Like it's very clear what they meant to me. I'm an excellent reader. Like I feel like more than I'm a writer or a translator, like I'm an excellent reader. So I've been so well trained by all of my schools and all of my teachers who beat it into me. So I don't need to ask them a question about the work. And yeah, and like because if they were a bad writer, then I would ask them questions all the time. But they're not bad writers.
You wouldn't want to translate them if they're bad writers.
Exactly. So yeah, so the logic works. Yeah.
I think maybe we'll turn it to the audience. I know there are people who've read your work or might be translating. Does anyone have a question?
Hello. With permission from Your Majesty, I would like to ask a question to the speaker. Hi, Anton. My name is Dichin. To the courtesy of Dr. Dolma and her book club, I was able to read this Towards Eternity, yeah, and I liked it mostly because of how much you have reference to the AI and the anxiety people feel around it. Especially the robot that reads poetry was a little scary. But on translation, if I can ask you a question, I used to read a lot of books by an author, and I used to think that he was really good, only to realize that, I actually used to think that his English was really good, only to realize that he never wrote them in English. It was all translated. And now my question is like, how much of the book is the original writers versus the translators? And do translators, do they add things of their own, even if they don't want to, unintentionally? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So as Bhutanese, you would understand this better than most people in the world, because if someone has reincarnated, do you love them as the person they used to be, or do you love them as the person they are? It's exactly the same. I cannot underemphasize like how the paradox between the two concepts, like how similar they are. I don't believe in, as you may have guessed by now, I don't believe in like 100% fidelity coming from one language to another. That is impossible. Like translation is about failure. You are going to fail. The question is, can you fail in an interesting way as opposed to a totally tedious and boring way that no one wants to read. And this is a question that, for example, conservative Korean professors never ask about translation. They want everything to be a literal academic translation that nobody wants to read. I have to exist in the capitalist world, so the work has to appeal to the English reading audience. Like, it has to give them something. I can't just be like, oh, you all should, worship Korean literature because it's so great. Like, that's a very weird attitude to have. But that's the attitude that Korean professors expect me to have, and I've been battling that all my life. I think that literature should go out towards the other culture and meet them halfway. You should, of course, expect readers to meet you halfway. You should not pander to the reading audience, obviously. But translation is about meeting someplace in like a third space. It's not about, going, like being colonized or, trying to like sell your wares like overseas or anything like that. It's about creating this third space where we could both meet as equals and appreciate each other like on a level that we probably may not be like on a political level or that kind of stuff. So I am actually totally fine if, I read a translation and the translation is like supposedly different from, the source. I think the translator has to put themselves into the work. A story I told this afternoon was about, one more story about Nicole Kidman when she was doing when she was starring in The Hours, and she had to figure out how to portray Virginia Woolf, and she decided to put a lot of herself into Virginia Woolf because she was going through divorce with Tom Cruise, and she wanted to use those emotions in the role, and that's why she won an Academy Award for that role. So I think it's the same for translators. Like, we have a lot in common with actors. Like, they use a lot of their own emotions and their own thoughts and their own ideas, like, and their own voice, like, in the character that they play. And you also have to, as a translator, construct that voice and construct that narrator from not just things that are around the narrator in the source, but also from yourself. That's the only way that the work will ring true for an actual reading audience. But if you're a Korean academic, you could do whatever and, and not make money. I don't know.
Any other questions? There's one there. Can you raise your hand? Oh, there's a question there.
Thank you for this opportunity. And then my question is, like, when you translate, sometimes there are inside jokes that get like missed in other languages. Like, I have one more local phrase, one proverb, which is like "Sipal hagisiru maparangisigo," and then if we translate that directly, it means "shake, shake, God, shake," but we have to shake. So, like, how do you translate the inside jokes? Thank you.
Sure. So Jeremy Tiang, great translator from Chinese, he always says, we don't translate words, we translate vibes. So it's really, when you're translating a joke, it's not so necessary to follow the dynamics of that joke. First of all, that's impossible and ridiculous. I once had a student who like made a footnote for every joke, and I'm like, that, if you have to explain the joke, that literally ruins it. Humor is inherently political. So whenever you see something that is funny, you have to look at what it's sending up, what it's satirizing, because humor is satire a lot in literature. So if the purpose of that wordplay is to kind of diffuse like the importance or the dignity of someone who is very pompous, for example, then there are many other ways that you can achieve the same ending. You don't have to use the same joke. You can make up another joke. And I think the power of Tomb of Sands, especially, Daisy Rockwell's translation of Gitanjali Shree's novel, she creates a lot of new English puns and a lot of new English jokes for the translation. And that's basically, what you do. The most important thing is to capture the vibe of the work, not like every little, tiny little nuance of every phenome in the sentence. Like an AI can do that. If you're a human being, you need to think at a higher level.
That's a very... I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I know we've talked a lot about AI, but clearly there is something very human about translation, both in the translation and in the reception of it. And I think this is a beautiful way to end today with the reminder of the power of language, its malleability, and the joy in reading and writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.